This is a Ulysses S. Grant bicentennial moment. 2022 is the bicentennial year of Ulysses S. Grant's birth. This is a series of vignettes that lift up the people, events, or moments of note in Grant's life as seen through his eyes. These are rich glimpses that give insight into Ulysses S. Grant's life and who or what impacted him to mold the leader he became. The series is available on the Facebook page Ulysses S. Grant Bicentennial Moments and the YouTube channel General Grant by himself. And now, when General Grant saved General Lee, June of 1865. I'm Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, and you join me today in the library. I should like to lift up for this bicentennial moment the efforts that I made, successful efforts, to prevent General Robert E. Lee and other high-ranking Confederate officers from being tried and hanged for treason. But first, I should like to read you the surrender terms upon which all of this is based, the following controversy. When I gave General Lee my conditions for surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, there were only 188 words, so I do not intend to bore you. However, it's important that you understand the wording of the surrender document and perhaps marvel at its brevity. Commander R.E. Lee, commanding C.S. Army, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, April 9, 1865. Headquarters, Armies of the United States. General, in accordance with the substance of my letter to you of the 8th instant, I propose to receive the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia on the following terms, to wit: rolls of all the officers and men to be made in duplicate, one copy to be given to an officer designated by me, the other to be retained by such officer or officers as you may designate, the officers to give their individual paroles not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged, and each company or regimental commander sign a like parole for the men of their commands. The arms, artillery, and public property to be parked and stacked and turned over to the officers appointed by me to receive them. This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, and this is the key element for today's episode with us together. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authority, so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they may reside. Very respectfully, U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Now that in total is 188 words. But when General Lee agreed to this and signed these conditions for surrender, that last sentence is of paramount importance. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authorities so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they may reside. In agreeing to this, General Lee knew that not one man would be sent to a prison camp, nor would anyone be tried for treason and, as a matter of course, in the timber of the times, hanged for treason. These were very generous terms. They were approved by President Lincoln. Congress heartily approved them, and the war essentially was ended, although surrenders of other forces in the field went through September of '65. Moreover, on the next day, as a matter of interest, On April the 10th, I issued Special Orders number 73, which said, the first part of the order, in the field, April 10th, 1865. All officers and men of the Confederate service paroled at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, who, to reach their homes, are compelled to pass through the lines of Union armies, will be allowed to do so and to pass free on all government transports and military railroads by Commander Lieutenant General Grant. So I provided free transportation on military railroads and transports to get the men and officers to the nearest depot to their home at no charge to the men. They just had to show their paroles. Now, of course, President Lincoln was assassinated, and on the 15th of April was dead, and President Andrew Johnson took office. He issued some amnesty declarations, but one on May the 29th of 65 read, in part with the exceptions that I should like to lift up. Andrew Johnson, President of the United States. I do proclaim and declare that I hereby grant to all persons who have directly or indirectly participated in the existing rebellion, except as hereinafter accepted, amnesty and pardon, with restoration of all rights of property, except as to slaves, and except in cases where legal proceedings under the laws of the United States providing for the confiscation of property of persons engaged in rebellion have been instituted. But upon the condition, nevertheless, that every such person shall take and subscribe the following oath or affirmation, and thenceforward keep, maintain said oath inviolate. And he had the oath, which came to be known as the ironclad oath. But the exceptions I lift up to you are, except there were some 14. 3D says, all who shall have been military or naval officers of said pretended Confederate government above the rank of colonel in the Army or lieutenant in the Navy. 5 or 5th exception, all who resigned or tendered resignations of their commissions in the Army or the Navy of the United States to avoid or evade duty in resisting the rebellion. 8th, all military and naval officers in the rebel service who were educated by the government in the military academy at West Point or the United States Naval Academy. And the last one, the 11th exception, all persons who have engaged in the destruction of the commerce of the United States upon the high seas, which covered the Alabama and the Shenandoah and the Florida and so forth. To my ignorance in what was happening, President Johnson pressed to have General Lee, General Longstreet, and other high-ranking officers indicted for treason, with every intention of having them arrested, tried, and probably hanged for treason. When the indictment in the Southern District, U.S. District Court in Norfolk, Virginia, on June the 7th of 1865 was held, an officer of the court, one of the people present, raised the issue that, or that of the parole conditions of surrender that General Lee had signed that had been preferred by me, that had been accepted, and that was a military treaty. What about those men in the indictments, federal indictments handed down against General Lee and General Longstreet and others? And Judge John C. Underwood of the U.S. District Court, Southern District Court of the State of Virginia, said this to the grand jury in his charge to that grand jury that handed down the indictments, quoting, "To an inquiry which has been made by an officer of the court whether the terms of parole agreed upon with General Lee were any protection to those taking the parole, the answer is that was a mere military arrangement and can have no influence upon civil rights or the status of the persons interested, end quote. So with a judicial wave of his hand, Judge Underwood took it upon himself to dismiss the treaty, the surrender that was offered to and accepted by General Lee at Appomattox. But let me repeat that. He said that whether the terms of parole agreed upon with General Lee were any protection to those taking the parole, the answer is that was a mere military arrangement. He dismissed the treaty that I presented to the surrender terms to General Lee, and General Lee accepted, just offhandedly dismissed them and said it was a mere military arrangement and can have no influence upon the civil rights or the status of the persons interested. Now, this is also a civilian court judge ruling on a military matter, a surrender of armies in the field. Two distinctly different worlds, I submit. But this was done without my knowledge. I was made aware on June the 13th of 1865, some 6 days, June the 7th, some 6 days after this indictment was handed down. And it's a letter to myself from General Lee. And General Lee wrote, "Upon reading the President's proclamation of the 29th ultimo," and I read those exceptions that I thought noteworthy for your attention, General Lee goes on, "I came to Richmond to ascertain what was proper or required of me to do. When I learned that, with others, I was to be indicted for treason by the grand jury at Norfolk. I had supposed that the officers and men of the Army of Northern Virginia were, by the terms of their surrender, protected by the U.S. government from molestation so long as they conformed to its conditions. I am ready to meet any charges that may be preferred against me, and do not wish to avoid trial. But if I am correct as to the protection granted by my parole, and am not to be prosecuted, I desire to comply with the provisions of the President's proclamation, and therefore enclose the required application, which I request in that event be acted upon." Well, I was not happy when I found out that apparently General Lee had been indicted for treason. And General Lee also wrote this letter to President Johnson the same day, June the 13th of 1865. "Being excluded from the provisions of amnesty and pardon contained in the proclamation of the 29th ultimo, I hereby apply for the benefits and full restoration of all rights and privileges extended to those included in its terms. I graduated at the Military Academy at West Point in June 1829, resigned from the U.S. Army in April 1861, was a general in the Confederate Army, and included in the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, 9 April 1865. I endorsed that letter and said this on the back of it: respectfully forwarded through the Secretary of War to His Excellency the President, with the earnest recommendation that this application of General R.E. Lee for amnesty and pardon may be granted him. The oath of allegiance required by the recent order of the President to accompany applications does not accompany this for the reason so as I am informed by General Ord," that would be General E.O.C. Ord. "The order requiring it had not reached Richmond when this had been forwarded." And Secretary of War Stanton also endorsed the letter, writing on the cabinet meeting docket, saying, "Presented by the Secretary of War and postponed for further consideration in the cabinet." I suspect Secretary of War Stanton was wanting to see how this matter would work itself out before he made any positive stand one way or the other. Now, I went to President Johnson between June 16th and June 20th and told him that he must stop this madness. And he resisted my entreaties. And I said, you cannot do this. You simply cannot do this, because General Lee gave me his word as a soldier that he would direct his men to lay down their arms and not take up again against the government of the United States, that he would not do that. I gave him my word as a soldier that if they returned to their homes and obeyed the laws in force where they resided, they would not be disturbed in their property or their persons. And I was adamant with the president and said, you can't do this. I gave him my word as a soldier. Now, you may do whatever you politicians do for whatever reason that you do them, but I'm a soldier, and I gave General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia my word. If they obeyed the laws and didn't take up arms again against the government, then they would not be disturbed. And now you've promulgated an indictment against him through a federal district court in Virginia. And President Johnson said he wanted to pursue it. And I told him, if you persist in this madness, I will resign my commission as Lieutenant General in the Army of the United States. I will resign my commission immediately. I staked my professional career and my life on pushing him to drop the matter. If he did not drop the matter, I was prepared to resign and endure whatever fate might await me. But I threatened to resign if he did not stop this process. And he asked me, well, when can I try him, arrest him and try him? And I said, never. You can never do that. Not according to the surrender. Well, he was not happy whatever about that. And I so advised the cabinet meeting about my intents if the matter was not dropped. But on June the 20th, I wrote this letter to General Lee. Your communications of date the 13th instant, stating the steps you had taken after reading the President's proclamation of the 29th ultimo with the view of complying with its provisions, is at hand. When you learned that, with others, you were to be indicted for treason by the grand jury at Norfolk, that you had supposed the officers and men of the Army of Northern Virginia were, by the terms of their surrender, protected by the United States government from molestation so long as they conform to its conditions, that you were ready to meet any charges that might be preferred against you and did not wish to avoid trial, but that if you were correct as to the protection granted by your parole and were not to be prosecuted, you desired to avail yourself of the President's amnesty proclamation, and in closing an application quoting, therefore with the request that in that event it be acted upon, has been received and forwarded to the Secretary of War with the following opinion endorsed by me. And I had written on the back of the letter, in my opinion, the officers and men paroled at Appomattox Courthouse and since, upon the same terms given to Lee, cannot be tried for treason so long as they observe the terms of their parole. This is my understanding. Good faith, as well as true policy, dictates that we should observe the conditions of that convention. Bad faith on the part of the government or a construction of that convention subjecting the officers to trial for treason would produce a feeling of insecurity in the minds of all the paroled officers and men. If so disposed, they might even regard such an infraction of terms by the government as an entire release from all obligations on their part. I advise the President you're playing with the proverbial dynamite in this matter. because if you persist in the arrest and trial of Robert E. Lee and other generals, officers, then those surrendered Confederate soldiers and other officers may feel like, since you have completely negated what they understood the treaty to be, then they understood it to be all bets are off, and they'll start fighting, and this time of guerrilla warfare, which would be an incomprehensible nightmare for our country. But I went on to say, I will state further that the terms granted by me met with the hearty approval of the President at the time, and of the country generally. The action of Judge Underwood in Norfolk has already had an injurious effect, and I would ask that he be ordered to quash all indictments found against parole prisoners of war, and to desist from the further prosecution of them, end quote. This opinion, as I return to General Lee, I am informed is substantially the same as that entertained by the government. I have forwarded your application for amnesty and pardon to the President with the following endorsement thereon, quoting, respectfully forwarded through the Secretary of War to the President with the earnest recommendation that this application of General R.E. Lee for amnesty and pardon may be granted him. The oath of allegiance required by a recent order of the President to accompany applications does not accompany this for the reason, as I am informed by General E.O.C. Ord, the order requiring it had not reached Richmond when this was forwarded. Very respectfully, U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. And I thought that that was the end of the matter. It was for the active prosecution of the indictments, arrest, and trial of General Lee and General Longstreet and other Confederate generals and officers. But I had met between June the 16th and June the 20th with President Johnson, cabinet meeting, and had told him I would resign if he didn't drop the matter. On June the 20th of 1865, Attorney General James Speed instructed the U.S. District Attorney in Norfolk not to arrest any paroled officers or soldiers. So on June 20th, it was effectively stopped, but it was not quashed, I found out later. On December the 25th of 1868, President Johnson issued a general amnesty proclamation that covered General Lee, who was barred, however, from holding state or federal office under the 14th Amendment. But he did issue an amnesty order on Christmas Day of '68 that did indeed cover General Lee. The indictment of General Lee was not formally quashed, until February the 15th of 1869. General Grant, now President Grant, I was inaugurated as the 18th President on March the 4th of 1869. So President Johnson did not quash that indictment until some 3 weeks before I took office as President. Those documents have all mysteriously disappeared. In conclusion, I think it paramount in importance to know that, yes, there was an effort, indeed, grand jury convened and indictments handed down for General Lee, General Longstreet, and other Confederate officers, which would most certainly have resulted in the trial and hanging of all of those who were arrested, given the tone, as I had said earlier, of the times. But I threatened, nay, I did not just threaten, I promised that I would resign my commission as Lieutenant General if this matter, this insanity, was not stopped. And President Johnson knew that I was not bluffing. And he stopped it. Now, obviously, he did not formally eliminate it until immediately before, 3 weeks before he left office. But he did not pursue it. after I threatened to resign my own commission. So I put my career in life on the line to keep General Lee and other Confederate soldiers, officers, from being arrested and tried for treason. I never told General Lee of this matter, and I do not think he ever learned of it. Perhaps he did. He never mentioned it to me. But I threatened to end my career to stop the indictment and arrest and trial of Robert E. Lee for treason. This brings me to the end of this bicentennial moment. I think that I have said for the moment quite enough on the subject. I invite you to join me for other bicentennial moments and learn of the events, people, and places in my life that were of great significance to me. I am Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, bidding you a fond adieu.